Hello, can everyone hear me? Great, thank you. I also really liked how when I came up on stage, everyone started going quiet. It made me feel very powerful. Okay, so good afternoon, comrades, friends, and fellow War on One members and supporters. In case you're wondering who I am, this powerful woman who came on the stage, I'm thanks. My name is Alia Al-Ghassain, and I'm the chair of War on One's Council of Management. And so I'm really happy to welcome you all today to our event, From Protest to Power. We want this to be a space where we gather not just to analyse the world, but also to think about how to change it. On behalf of War on One, I want to thank everyone in the room for being here, and I should also say that this is a hybrid event, and we've had hundreds of people join online as well. And we're here together in community, in resistance, and in the spirit of internationalism as well. So today's event brings together two vital conversations that are deeply interconnected: the struggle against genocide and occupation, and the fight against poverty and exploitation. Both are driven by the same systems of colonialism, capitalism, and global injustice. And we should be clear, this is not a time for silence, not when bombs are falling on Gaza, not when our government is complicit in war crimes, not when people in Britain are choosing between heating and eating, not when billionaires are hoarding wealth built on the backs of working people while governments criminalize dissent and turn their backs on justice. Our first panel this afternoon, Israel's Genocide and UK Complicity, confronts the brutal reality of Israel's genocide in Gaza, its ethnic cleansing of the West Bank, a state built on colonialism and apartheid. We are watching a crime unfolding in real time, with tens of thousands killed, homes flattened, hospitals bombed, and an entire population pushed to the brink of starvation. And now, as Israel bombs Iran after already bombing Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen, messianic extremists and fundamentalists are determined to start a new regional war that will once again result in the loss of countless lives, just as the war in Iraq did. Yet as the world watches, no matter what level of brutality and depravity from the Israeli state, the UK government shamefully continues to supply weapons, offer diplomatic cover, and tries to silence those who dare to speak out. And we should be clear, this is not passive complicity. This is actually active support. UK arms companies are profiting. Politicians are turning protest into a criminal offence, and it is Palestinians who are paying the price. But even against this bleak backdrop, there is still resistance. Every march, every student encampment, every campaign to shut down arms factories and those who profit from it, it's part of a growing global movement that refuses to be silent in the face of genocide. And it carries within it the legacy of the South African anti-apartheid struggle. And this afternoon, we are extremely honoured to be joined by voices on the front lines of that struggle, voices of truth, of courage, and of solidarity. Our second panel is going to bring the fight closer to home, and yet also stretches globally. Here in the UK, we are in the grip of a cost of living crisis created not by scarcity, but by greed. Families are going hungry while energy giants post record profits. Wages are frozen while private jets fill the skies. Meanwhile, across the global south, debt, austerity, and climate catastrophe continue to devastate communities. And these are all legacies of a system designed to extract and to exploit. This is not a coincidence. It's the architecture of capitalism, a system that produces obscene wealth for a few and organized abandonment for the rest of us. But again, there is resistance here, from striking workers to communities building alternatives, from international debt campaigns to climate justice coalitions. People are demanding a fairer world, rejecting the politics of austerity, wanting to defend public services and public ownership, and building power from below. The theme of today's event is From Protest to Power, because we know that these are not separate things. Our protests are political, and our politics are shaped by struggle, by the people on the picket lines, on the streets, and under siege. War on Want has always stood with movements, not just to defend human rights, but to also fight for system change. This means ending the arms trade. It means dismantling the structures of imperialism and apartheid. That means redistributing wealth and power, not as a charity, but as justice. We are here today not just to listen, but to act, not just to bear witness, but to build, because our solidarity must be more than symbolic. It must be material, strategic, fierce, and always unrelenting. And that means we have to build our collective power, to learn from each other and to fight together, for Palestine, for economic justice, and for a world where the lives of the many matter more than the profits of the few. War on Want has been an organization that has always spoken truth to power and believed that in the power of people when organized to transform the world. And in that spirit, we are launching a bold plan for a global transition for the right to everyone to live with dignity and in harmony with the planet. We will be launching a new political education program of movement building and of fighting for policies that are in the interests of the many, not the few. We can only do this with your support, so I urge you that if you aren't a member of War on Want, please do join us. I'm not going to take up any more time. I'm going to invite Rafeef to perform a poem, and then Sarona, my good friend and comrade, will be moderating the first panel. Thank you.
Okay, I think Alia deserves a much louder round of applause. I think people sometimes underestimate what it is taking for us Palestinians to still wake up every day and come out and say that we exist, we resist, and we want to continue to keep organizing with the rest of you. So that's why I say Alia deserves a massive round of applause, not just today, but every day. I was asked to perform a poem. I will not perform one of my own poems. I thought it was very important to start the day bringing the voice of a Palestinian poet from Gaza who was murdered in this last war. This is Refuge from Hiba Abu Nada. Hiba wrote this poem on October 10th and was killed 10 days later on October 20th. May she rest in power. I grant you refuge. I grant you refuge in invocation and prayer. I grant you refuge. I grant you refuge in invocation and prayer. I bless the neighborhood and the minaret, to guard the children from the rocket from the moment it is a general's command until it becomes a raid. I grant you refuge. I grant you and the little ones refuge. The little ones who change the rocket's course before it lands with their smiles. I grant you and the little ones refuge. The little ones now asleep like chicks in a nest. They don't walk in their sleep towards dreams. They know death lurks outside the house. I grant you refuge. They don't walk in their sleep towards dreams. They know death lurks outside the house. Their mother's tears are now doves following them, trailing behind every coffin. I grant the father refuge. I grant the father refuge, the little one's father who holds the house upright when it tilts after the bombs. He implores the moment of death, have mercy. Spare me a little while. For their sake, I have learned to love my life. Grant them a death as beautiful as they are. I grant you refuge. I grant you refuge from hurt and death, refuge in the glory of our siege. Here in the belly of the whale, our streets exalt God with every bomb. They pray for the mosques and the houses, and every time the bombing begins in the north, our supplications rise in the south. I grant you refuge. I grant you refuge. I grant you refuge from hurt and suffering. With words of sacred scripture, I shield the oranges. I shield the oranges from the sting of phosphorus and the shades of cloud from the smog. I grant you refuge. I grant you refuge in knowing that the dust will clear. I grant you refuge in knowing that the dust will clear, and they who fell in love, and died together, will one day laugh. I grant you refuge. I grant you refuge. Thank you.
Please, all panelists for the first session, join the stage.
If there's just... Hi, everyone. Thank you, Rafeef. Yeah, it's really, really hard doing this on a day-to-day basis. And thank you to everyone who's here on this panel. Thank you to Warren Want for inviting us. My name is Sarona Bedwan. I'm the Outreach and Programs Manager at Makan. And this is our Resisting the UK's Role in Israel's Genocide and Apartheid. I'll go ahead and just introduce co-panelists, and then we'll kind of get launched into the discussion. But it'll be about 35, 40 minutes of moderated conversation, and then we'll have time for questions. Not comments, questions, for about 20 minutes. So I have Dr. Mahim Qureshi, a London-based cardiosurgeon, barrister? Solicitor, sorry. George Collecott, a lawyer working to challenge the UK arms exports to Israel. And then we have Dr. Rafeef Ziadah, who just read out an incredible poem by a murdered Palestinian poet. Poet, activist, extraordinaire. So I don't want to spend too much time introducing them, because I'd rather them actually talk about their work in themselves. And Alia so brilliantly already laid the landscape for what we're kind of experiencing. But I think always just as a way of setting up the space, I think it's always really, really important to ground where we're at right now and what the last 20 months have been teaching us. First of all, that history did not start on the 7th, that what we have been seeing since October 2023 is an acceleration of the genocide that began in 1948 by Israel. What we're also seeing as well is the highest price that Palestinian society is paying for what has become such a massive global uprising for liberation, for justice, for freedom, for dignity. And this is obviously something that not only scares Israel as an ethno-state, but scares those states who are invested in maintaining Israel as a proxy imperialist power. I do want to say just in one thing, in addition to what Alia has already laid out, is that students at universities are launching hunger strikes across the states. Palestinians are continuing to resist the conditions that are oppressing us. And especially here in Britain, we are seeing people not giving up. And I think that's kind of the energy I wanted to take into this. And ultimately for us to always be reminded of the fact that no matter how, I suppose, the kind of world that we need to be living in is so far away from us and so far away from our reach, we have no choice but to keep going. And every single person who feels alienated, we need to organize, and we need to essentially always remind ourselves that if we don't do the work we need to do, we will not bring about the world we need to bring about. And we have 3 people here who really exemplify that.
So what I'd like to go ahead and do is start off with Dr. Mahim, and maybe if each of you can please speak for about 5 minutes about your work, what you'd like to share with the audience, and then I'll just go back and then ask you each a question, if that sounds okay. So if you'd like to speak about your work, Dr. Mahim, thank you.
Thank you so much. So I'm a vascular surgeon based in London. And when I chose to go to Gaza in April 2024, at the time the middle area where Al-Aqsa Hospital is located, there had been no vascular surgeon present there for 3 months. But 10 or more children every day were losing at least one limb. We, myself and my wonderful team, our entry into Gaza was delayed by a couple of days and 48 hours. And the reason it was delayed was 48 hours before we entered, Al-Aqsa Hospital was again bombed. And 24 hours before we entered along the route that we were due to take, the World Central Kitchen humanitarians were murdered en route. As devastated as we were for the loss of life, for the ongoing loss of life, I remember the fear that we had in our team at that time was not for our own lives as much as it was, perhaps we won't now be allowed to enter. When we started work in Al-Aqsa Hospital, the dire situation became apparent extremely quickly. It was a hospital that was set up as a maternity unit for a couple of hundred patients at most, that had almost 1,000 inpatients and more than 3,000 people sheltering therein, with no floor space, no defined wards, very few patients actually in beds. They were all over the floor, anywhere that they could find space at that time. We had complete lack of surgical equipment, from the most basic scalpels and instruments with which to hold sutures. We didn't have any sterile surgical drapes, and we used to cut holes into surgical gowns in order to be able to perform operations. It struck me because we were living amongst the people within the hospital where we wanted to be, but it was April at that time, and the weather was beautiful. It was very similar to the weather here today, a warm, sort of springish day. And people were wearing as many layers as they could. And I noticed this very quickly, that people felt much colder than I did, and I realized that this was because they were extremely hungry already. Going into Gaza is a very easy decision to make. Leaving Gaza is, I cannot begin to explain the pain when you have to turn your back on your fellow professionals, on your patients, on your people, the warmth and the love and the hospitality from the people of Gaza, who are left with absolutely nothing, but still they try and give you everything, and somehow you leave so much richer than when you arrived. And I think most of us who have ever been just long to go back, and I was lucky that I was able to go back. And I spent a month this time in Al-Mawasi, in Nasser Hospital, which is in the south. This is a so-called humanitarian zone, or was at the time. Despite it being a humanitarian zone, in the last 2 to 3 weeks of my time there, we dealt with at least one mass casualty event a day within the humanitarian zone. My team that I had left behind, my colleagues, my friends, people that had become more like my family, they were completely emaciated. Children's hair color had grown so much lighter because of severe protein malnutrition. And if I thought that things were bad the first time, I wasn't prepared for just how desperate the situation had become at that time. The hospital was still functioning, however. Nasser Hospital is the only hospital in the south that has a CT scanner, that has an oxygen supply, that has a blood bank, and that has a dialysis unit. That hospital is now, as of this week, within a red zone, and the area around it has been ordered to evacuate. This means annihilation for the population of southern Gaza. And I urge all of us to do whatever we can do to stop this from happening.
Thank you. George, if you'd like to talk about your work for about 5 minutes, please.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Mahim. And you were there around a month ago outside the Courts of Justice for the hearing brought by our client organisation, Alhacken, which is an amazing Palestinian human rights organisation led by the heroic human rights defender, Shawan Jabreen. So I'm here. I work for the Global Legal Action Network, and I'm a consultant solicitor at Bindmans as well. And we are represented Alhacken challenging the government's continued supply of arms to Israel. It's important to note we started. So I've been at the organisation since October, but Alhacken and my colleagues at GLAN had started thinking about these issues and trying to press for a legal case well before the 7th of October. Then around a week after the 7th of October, that's when we issued proceedings, and it's only last month that we had a full and final hearing on the issues. I keep thinking about what role the law has in these sorts of things, and like societal change won't happen in a UK courtroom. But what it can do is reveal some of the hypocrisy and the inhumanity of the government's present and continuing position. And some of the arguments that they made in court were truly horrific. Firstly, they are attempting to gut the duty to prevent genocide. The government argued that the duty to prevent genocide only kicks in after a genocide has been committed and an international court has ruled that a genocide has been committed. Our clients, Alhacken, made the common sense argument that that's not a duty to prevent genocide. And in response, the government's lawyer stood up and said that our clients were trying to make a wishy-washy lower standard, or trying to put forward a wishy-washy lower standard, which just shows the inhumanity of the government's argument and position. Similarly, they've been telling Parliament for months that it's not for the government or Parliament to make a decision on whether there's a serious risk that a genocide is taking place, that it's instead a matter for the courts. However, at court, they said that this is not justiciable. They said that the courts were barred from considering it. So they're avoiding scrutiny at every turn. Then regarding the genocidal statements said by all levels of the Israeli government and army and military, the government's dismissed those, saying that that is simply political posturing. The most glaring fact, which we were almost barred from arguing because the government in September did make a slight concession and stop 30 military licenses from going to Israel. But they did that on the basis that they had to accept that there was a serious risk that UK arms could be used in violation of international humanitarian law. But they did that on the basis of international humanitarian law breaches in detention. They found by September last year, 10 months into the genocide, they examined only 413 incidents as whether they would be possible violations of IHL, and found that only one incident was a possible violation of international humanitarian law, and that was the World Central Kitchen incident. So any bombing the only bombing really that killed white people in this genocide was the only one event that the government decided that it was even a possible breach of international humanitarian law. Then I think, I want to close quickly, but one final point that became clear throughout the hearing is the government didn't assess. Well, sorry, if I get my notes out, I want to make sure that I'm not missing anything. So in coming to their assessment, the government didn't take into account the deliberate targeting of civilian men. They said that, and regarding the deliberate targeting of civilian women and children, they said that they weren't shown any evidence, which was untrue. I mean, just look at the news each day and you'll find it, but we submitted reams and reams of evidence of civilians being sniped, and yeah, there's simply, not only is it an error of law, it's just morally abhorrent. So yeah, the government is continuing to supply F-35 parts into a global supply chain. They say that they can't stop it because of, in order to protect international peace and security. But there is, our case was that was incredibly flawed, because there's no international peace and security carve out to the Genocide Convention or the Geneva Conventions. So we are currently waiting on the judgment, which should be out over the next few months or next few weeks. But yeah.
Thank you so much, George. Rafeef?
Thank you so much, Sarona, for the very kind introduction. I wanted to mention the work of War on Want. Many moons ago, when I had much less white hair, I worked at War on Want as the militarism officer, which was always a scary title. It should have been called the anti-militarism officer. And it really scares me that it has been years since then, and the reports and materials that War on Want had put out at that stage and that research around the military supply chain and the aiding and abetting of the Israeli government in its actions, in its occupation and settler colonialism has gotten more consistent. And if only governments had listened to these reports back then, 10 years ago and 20 years ago, maybe we could have avoided a full-on genocide. And this is to just also point to the strength of War on Want and the history of War on Want of working around Palestine. It is, I would say, one of the only organizations in this country that is a registered charity that has been so bold on issues of justice and Palestine, and so consistent, not just from this genocide, but way before. And although we are speaking about this genocide, I always want to stress that things in Gaza were not okay or normal before this genocide. Before this genocide, there was already an ongoing siege. There was already malnutrition. Already, it was one of the highest unemployment rates in the world. So already there was a slow suffocation of the people of Gaza. I know some people have woken up during this genocide and realized what was happening, but we really need to take into account that this situation has been ongoing, what we Palestinians call the ongoing Nakba, well before October 7th. And it's important to remind ourselves of that, because no matter what happens now, our work for this to never happen again is only beginning. And we need to ensure that we are on the streets and that we are organizing consistently, but also, as Alia mentioned earlier, deeply and strategically and meaningfully, so we are never back at this point again. I work with an organization called Workers in Palestine. It comes out of the Palestinian trade union movement. And right at the beginning of the genocide, Palestinian trade unions collectively, every association, every trade union issued a call to trade unions internationally to end the arms supply to Israel. The entire point was that those machines that are raining death on the Palestinian people are coming from somewhere. Most of the time, they are coming from your own backyards. There are factories up and down this country that are making parts for the F-16s, the F-35, and the drones. So when we speak about complicity, it's not just a pretty word that we like to use. It's not just a sophisticated word. It's actually very real and very material. Not only did we see the British government ministers come out and give Israel a green light, we continue to see the arms trade openly. Yes, a few licenses were revoked, and Lamy got up and made a huge deal out of the licenses that were revoked. Those were less than a fraction of the arms licenses that continue to go to Israel. And again, it is happening right here in our backyard. So the call from Palestine, from the trade unions, has echoed internationally. Some unions have taken action, and just in the past week, to point you to one inspiring action that took place, dock workers at the port of Marseille refused for an arms shipment to continue on the ship that they were using. Following that, in Genoa and every other place that arms shipment was supposed to stop, dock workers refused to handle it. One thing to say about those actions is that often we just hear about the last 5 minutes of the story. When the dock workers refused, we see the headline. We don't see the hours of work and deep organizing that goes into getting us to that moment. And what we've been trying to do in Workers in Palestine is actually work deeply within the trade union movement to have rank and file networks in every single trade union that is pushing the trade union leaderships to take action. And I have to say, this is quite difficult, especially when the Keir Starmer government keeps talking about defense spending as their way to tackle austerity. And this makes some in the trade union movement think that arms are the way to go to tackle austerity without ever asking the question of where are those arms ending up. So there's a very serious conversation that needs to be had around this defense spending and what it means, and around the trade union movement also not being complicit in the death and destruction of Palestinian life. This work is happening across many unions. Just very recently in the cultural sector, we did a lot of work with Equity, which is the cultural workers union. And for the first time, there was a motion passed to actually protect artists who want to work on Palestine from being shut down. Again, this was, thank you. Again, this took a lot of work, a lot of painful, slow work, but we eventually got there because, and this is very important for all of us, to keep us quiet from talking about the genocide in Gaza, they have to shut us down here as well. And our freedom of expression here gets curtailed. Our right to speak here gets curtailed. So when we speak for Palestine, we're actually also speaking for our freedoms here. A lot of people think they are saving Palestine. The slogan in Palestine is that today Palestine is freeing the rest of the world. And we're very glad we have you on that journey with us.
Can we get a round for all of them? Thank you. We've got about 20 minutes. No, I'm going to say 25 minutes left because we started a bit late. Sorry. I'm just going to go ahead and ask each of you a question, maybe speak for about 5 minutes about it or so. And it's just going to basically directly riff off of what each of you have said. Dr. Mahim, I just wanted to start off with you. And I'd like to ask you, you said, it's an easy decision to go to Gaza, but to leave was difficult. Could you please maybe speak to the audience a bit about why that decision was easy for you and what led you there? Because I think it's, again, when we're thinking about responsibility, about the kind of systematic efforts that are being made to sever the responsibility that we have to each other globally, I think it's maybe always really important to remind people of actually like the power we can have together. Would that be okay?
I went because it was the right thing to do. We each of us in this room, irrespective of which walk of life we come from, whatever it is we do for a living, whatever it is we do at home, we each have a gift to give, and we each have something unique which we can offer a place which is full of love, but destroyed of absolutely everything that there could be. There is no school. There are barely any medical facilities. There are no educational institutions. There's no cafe left. There's no music shop left. There's nothing left. It has been razed to the ground. This is, surgery is what I do for a living, and that was what I could offer. because leaving is so painful, and it is so hard to. It's interesting, actually. I've lived in many different parts of the world, and I've often felt like an outsider in many different parts of the world. I have never felt as accepted and as grounded and just that I completely belong. And I genuinely mean this hand on heart, as I did when I entered Gaza. And to leave that is excruciatingly painful. And especially because you are leaving your colleagues. Because you're in this pressure cooker situation, not only with your team, but with the people that you work with there and the people who are living within the hospital confines. You form bonds, I feel, much quicker than you normally do in the rest of your life, and leaving them is very hard. So to help counter that, what we have done here is I have set up an online surgical education program to try and make up for the lost surgical education due to the complete destruction of all surgical training programs. And we launched a few weeks ago. Everything was going extremely well, except last week, or just a few days ago, the last remaining telecommunication system has been destroyed within Gaza. And people that I hear from on a daily basis, I am now completely unable to get any news from. Some people are able to use eSIMs, which are barely functional. And over the last few days, I am receiving messages from people as though it might be the last one that they sent. This is not normal for the Palestinian spirit. These are the most resilient people that I have ever encountered anywhere in the world. And they are human beings. And what they have endured, it's not possible for me to put into words here. It is not possible for anybody to describe. It's extremely worrying because I was there on a date that telecommunications were knocked out temporarily where I was due to an Israeli strike. And what followed, the bombardment that followed, was off the scale. We're in a situation now that all telecommunications are down. The world is looking slightly away, not far away, but to what is currently happening between Iran and Israel at the moment. We do not know what is happening in Gaza today. We have no information. We have no news.
Thank you. I just want to pause for a moment because it's kind of unspeakable what's happening, and I think sometimes when I'm at events and they just try to plot on as normal, I'm like, this isn't normal. We should be able to like show emotion and really remind ourselves like what's happening is so beyond comprehension. So yeah, there's something that I think you're really embodying in your work, which is what you said is we each have a gift to give. And I think sometimes people think if you maybe don't come from a walk of life where you were already involved in grassroots organizing, or you're in a trade union, but you don't know necessarily a lot about Palestine, or maybe you have different skill sets that somehow you're not fit or ready enough to give. But I think it's always important to remind ourselves as well, we each have something to give and we each have a role to play.
You just need to be human, that's all.
Fully.
You just need to be human. And that is what is missing in government stances, in political excuses. It's the humanity.
And one thing I want to shout out, there's a Palestinian organization called Hamle, who focus on digital rights and advocacy, and they actually have a report that they published in the last few months that looks at the role of the telecommunications sector in perpetuating the genocide. So please check out their work. They do incredible work, and they've been focusing on the role of telecommunications as a way of further oppressing people. So in case to educate ourselves on that. And one last thing, sorry, I'm taking up too much time right now. Just in response to the online surgical education program that you set up, something that's been coming out of Palestinian scholars and academics from Gaza is the Higher Education Committee in Gaza to directly support Palestinian students and scholars who are either still on the ground or in exile, but always want to say, even though every single university has been destroyed, the institution still stands. So if you do play a role at an education space in some way, some form, please know that Palestinians in those spaces have made direct demands as well that you can respond to. I want to hand it over to you, George. And the question I'd like to ask is, you said, what does the role of law have in making change? Can I ask you just to speak a bit more about, I suppose, what that's been like for you in your practice, and maybe how you've been seeing law being used in juxtaposition to other forms of bringing about accountability and justice, and maybe, speaking to the audience a bit about how, in what ways can they look at law, I suppose, if that makes sense.
Yeah, of course. Law, especially in this country, most of the government's arguments, even in this case, where the courts can't look at this is a political issue, this is something for the government. So it does feel really disheartening to try to push for change as a lawyer. And like always, change has only been brought through protest and direct action. So I see the role of lawyers as more of a secondary supporting role, but what you can do is get some crucial wins. So there's an amazing organisation called the European Legal Support Centre, which has been doing critical work helping out academics, artists who speak out for Palestinian rights and have been subjected to a detriment in their workplace and beyond. And then also speaking to colleagues at Alhacken, they are imploring any lawyer to do what they can do for the people taking direct action, for the Filton 18. So I feel like, and there have, even though it looks bleak, there are political prisoners in the UK who have been put in solitary confinement before they've managed to get a trial. There have been wins I just saw a friend at Garden Court North Chambers, one of her clients was acquitted for conspiracy to commit criminal damage, I believe, in connection with the Palestine Action protest. And that was because they were allowed to put to the jury the extent of the genocide in Gaza. So you are able to get, I guess, it's a complex question that I haven't really found an answer to, but it's,
Sorry, I didn't mean to trip you up.
No worries, no.
I think the main reason why I asked that was because I think so often, if I'm speaking to people, they're just like, oh, well, I think there's sometimes a dismissal or thinking of, okay, bringing about accountability and justice can only happen within one sphere, as opposed to maybe seeing it as like a multi-pronged approach that can take, different kinds of realms and forms of, I suppose, like different fields. So I think it's always good to remind people, actually, law obviously has its limitations, but we do still need to use it on some level.
Absolutely, 100%. And also not to see it as a vacuum. I feel like a lot of what Alhacken has been amazing at doing is by using this case as a jumping off point for getting the message out to a wider audience. So that's another way that I think that cases like this can contribute.
Thank you. And just one last point before I hand it over to Rafeef and ask her question. Organizations that work on the ground, like Alhacken, are they've always been targeted by Israel, but there is a new piece of legislation that Israel is trying to push through, where it's basically attempting to further the elimination of international presence on the ground from the river to the sea. One that works within 48, or what's called Israel, is trying to penalize organizations that get international funding that don't come from the Israeli government. And what they're wanting to do is to basically charge those organizations, tax them, the Israeli government, about 80% of the donations that they get, which obviously would most likely come only at Palestinian organizations. So that's something that I think Smotrich is trying to do. But simultaneously in the West Bank, which is going to be an easier thing to push through, is also forcing charities that work on the ground or grassroots or NGOs to re-register themselves through the Israeli occupying authorities, and those authorities can deny them charity status or NGO status, which means any organizations that work there will then have to force their employees to leave Palestine and then have to shut down. And so there's all these systematic ways in which like the work that we do here that relies on Palestinians being able to do the work there is very directly under threat through bureaucratic colonial measures. I'll stop there. Rafeef, with your work with workers in Palestine, I suppose that's quite a behemoth of things. But maybe just within the time that we have, maybe what I'd like to ask you is for people here who may or may not be in a trade union, but may or be interested in looking at ways in which to work with workers in Palestine or understanding how do we even get started in this. Do you mind just speaking to them very briefly and about actually that this is within reach, but also the necessity of sometimes the non-glamorous work of this necessary work as well? Thank you.
Thank you for a great question. A lot of people are very alienated by their trade unions. We're also at the lowest density of trade unions historically. There's also been an attack on trade unions since the time of glamorous Thatcher in this country that really destroyed labor rights in such a strong way. So it doesn't surprise me that even people in workplaces sometimes don't realize who they're unionized with. And a lot of times I get basic questions like, well, I don't think I'm a worker because I'm a freelancer. And I have to explain to people, if you need to work to make a living and you would starve without that, then you are a worker. But we're at that level of organizing. And I think the past attacks on the trade union movement and on all the social movements has really eroded our organizing capacity. And it's about building them up. And that building is not always glamorous actions. It's not always just about social media. A lot of it is about mobilizing people and organizing people. And I think there's a very important distinction to make here between the work of mobilizing versus organizing. And this is something trade unionists talk about quite a lot. Because mobilizing is about quick actions. You want to get people out. And we've been doing that as the Palestine Solidarity Movement, especially in this country, for the past 2 years with the large demonstrations and all of the actions. But actual deep organizing is a different form of work that takes meeting people where they're at. It takes understanding what their workplace issues are. So workers in Palestine, we do workshops with people who are interested in this work. Political education around, well, how do you actually do it? How do you have these organizing conversations? One of the most hilarious things to me always when we do these sessions is we have an exercise called 80-20, which is listening for 80% of the time. And all the activists are always baffled by this. They always think, oh, I didn't realize you had to listen to people for 80% of the time. So there's a lot of skills around this type of building, the unglamorous, the day-to-day, actually getting people to understand Palestine. But I find the importance of it is that we want people to be sustained activists for life, not just for this moment where there's something that they see as a crisis. This is a crisis, but the crisis for Palestine has been going. I mean, I was born into a siege. I was born into a war. I lost most of my family to a war already. So this for us is a deja vu on repeat, but exploded in time. It is the logical end of where Zionism was going to take us as a supremacist project that doesn't see Palestinians as human beings. This is just the logical end of where it was always going to be. So for us, making sure that people are sustained activists in the movement for the long term and can link Palestine to other issues, including workplace issues here, is really what's crucial. We have a lot of information on our website about how do you start building, how do you start speaking to your coworkers. We're always happy to organize workshops at workplaces with people to begin this work. We've really tried to be out there saying this day in and day out, and we realize people are alienated from their trade unions, but we need the work to happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Before maybe we have time for questions, I will ask the War on Want staff in a moment. Can we please give our panelists a massive round of applause for the work that they're doing? In Arabic, we say "Yatikum al-afia." I don't know how to translate that. I'm sorry. Hello. Do we have time for questions? 15 minutes. Okay. Can I please, if you have questions, not comments, I will take it. And we also have a roaming mic. Okay. I see this person here in the blue shirt. We will start off with you.
Thank you, and thank you for a fascinating, if not depressing, conversation. My question's around apathy. I've been a supporter of an organisation called Visualising Palestine for about 10 years, and they recently did a recruitment drive, which I shared online. You can feel the virtual air leaving the room when you post anything about supporting Palestinians. My question is, how do you remove the fear that people have in speaking out against all the things that they're seeing going on, and they're horrified about, but they're too scared of the consequences of saying anything? Because I think that's obviously a huge problem, and it's engineered by Israel to be that way. So how do we break that?
Should we take one at a time and let people answer? Yallah? Okay. Would you like to? There you go. You've got the mic.
Thank you. Thank you for a great question. So, yes, and in my profession, this has been a real problem. Doctors, healthcare professionals have been targeted. Some doctors have been referred to the GMC for speaking out. And it hasn't yet stopped me. I hope it never does. I think that one of the reasons why it's very difficult for people to come after me is that I have stuck to facts rather than opinions. And I have given eyewitness testimony. And I have told the truth, which is not possible to deny. And I think that speaking out about Palestine is straightforward because there are just so many wonderful things about Palestine. We often hear, oh gosh, 65% of men were unemployed, therefore, of course, they're going to be radicalized. However, Palestine has the highest, and Gaza has the highest literacy rate in the Middle East. Has one of the highest densities of PhDs per population. Compared to many other parts of the Middle East as well. This is a highly educated country. These are very educated people. They're highly intelligent people. They're incredibly loving people. And these are facts. And if I were called in front of the General Medical Council for my delivery of these facts, this is, again, what I would have to say.
Thank you. Any of the other speakers would like to say anything before?
I just want to say thank you for the question, because I think more and more people are asking this. It's incredible at how many events I go to now where people are getting tired. And I think a lot of us at the beginning of the genocide thought if we go out and demonstrate and the demonstrations are big enough, it's going to make a difference. And I mean, I don't know if it was naivete, but we really believed it. We thought these governments were democratic, and if there's 1 million people on the street, lots of people kept referring to the war on Iraq, and I had to remind them that the war in Iraq did happen, and 1 million people did die. And this is where actually opening up spaces for conversations around this apathy and this fear is really important. But that has to happen also in our workplaces. A lot of times we push that away by saying the demonstrations will just work. And the demonstrations are, of course, incredibly important. But until we can also bring that conversation to every single community and space we have, and there is fear, but to acknowledge the fear, to realize that it's there, to tell people we know you're scared, but let's have these small conversations. Sometimes they're one-on-one, I've spoken to colleagues who didn't know anything about Palestine, were told not to add anything on their syllabus about Palestine because they may not get promoted. And I had to take them out for a coffee and have a conversation. And that's what I mean about sometimes the work is very small steps to break the fear, and sometimes there's leaps. We are at the most horrid thing that has happened is all of this death has made people think about Palestine and look at Palestine. And I think generally your average person today thinks this is wrong. So we have an opportunity to break this fear if we speak to people.
Thank you. Did you want to say
Yeah, just super briefly, just working on your point of what you were saying about how the trade union movement in this country has we've never had a lower trade union density. So firstly, expanding the trade union movement is one thing to make sure that a worker feels secure in their ability to stand up to their employer. And then also knowing that even though there has been a massive erosion in employment rights, you still have them, and it's very comparatively easy to assert. It's free to go to the employment tribunal, and it costs employers a hell of a lot of money if you simply assert your rights, and a lot of the time they do want to come to well, not because of their compassion, but just because of the financial risk that it would take. The financial risk that there is in not coming to a outcome that is satisfying to both parties.
Thank you. And one last, I think, maybe point to raise is also speaking of closing of spaces, there's also the closing of space in the criminalization of Palestine through education. So through the organization that I work for, Makan, we're a Palestinian-led transformative educational organization, and we've been working with educators on exactly this. How do you bring Palestine into your university space, into the classroom, in tandem with all of the other ways in which that Palestine should be brought in? So just putting it out there if you're an educator. Any other questions? Do you have a question for one of the panelists, I suppose, going off of that?
Yeah, what would you like to say about that? Do you think that's a good idea or not?
On if they think that twinning is an effective way? Yeah. Any responses?
I mean, I know anecdotally that I was speaking to an SNP MP, Chris Law, who is the MP for Dundee, I believe, and I can't remember which Palestinian town or city Dundee is twinned with, but this has happened in the past. And yeah, I feel like from GLAN's perspective, what we're moving on to is focusing most of our energy to combat settler colonialism, and the cases that we're planning to bring are going to take years and years of sustained pressure from civil society organizations. So yeah, pressing question, and these things are happening. I think it's more of highlighting type issue.
Yeah, I mean, twinning has been in the process for many, many years. The question I would ask is twinning for what purpose? Because sometimes councils especially do twinning in order to not speak about divestment. Because twinning can mean that you bring a debka troupe or a poet to come to the council, and that's great. Palestinian culture is beautiful and brilliant, but we want the twinning to also be about divestment, about ensuring that pension funds aren't invested in the arms trade. So it's not just symbolic twinning. And again, sometimes these campaigns are gradual and it's a step to get you somewhere else. But a lot of activist energies sometimes go into twinning without the strategic thinking of why are we moving in this direction. So I would just say, just planning it out and thinking, what are we trying to get out of this at the end? And is the council just trying to do something cosmetic in the short term so they don't actually do something about the arms trade? In this moment of genocide, I think the most urgent thing is to keep pressuring around the arms trade. The British government, because of the legal cases and the trade unions and all the work, is feeling cornered and feeling the pressure, and we really need to keep moving in that direction. And if there's plans for twinning, we need to figure out how they can add to that pressure.
So put our energies into things that are material, not symbolic. Did you let her? Khalas. Okay, no. Am I being told to stop? No, you've got a question. I said, yeah, yalla.
Yeah, no question, sorry. I just wanted to ask, obviously in recent weeks we saw that fact that hundreds or 300 civil servants in the Foreign Office raised concerns about the UK being complicit in breaching of international law, and the response has been, well, resign. I wonder, again, because of Rafeef, that mention of Iraq, and many of us felt, of course, that one of the greatest injustices that nobody in the UK government was ever held liable for that illegal war. Do you seriously believe that we can ever hold, whether it's Keir Starmer, David Lammy, or these individual ministers, individually liable for complicity in war crimes and crimes against humanity? And what kind of movement do you think would enable that to become more realistic as a political objective of our campaign?
Thank you.
I'll address the question of whether it can. Yes. So, I mean, if you just compare it to like aiding and abetting a murder, if you give a gun to someone, like the government knows, Israel has said what it was planning to do, and it's done what it's planned to do, and the UK has kept supplying arms. That is criminal and attaches criminal liability to those who are making the decisions. That's the position of GLAN, and that's what also Alhacken and so many other organisations won't stop pressing until we can bring prosecutions. I mean, there are so many barriers in the way of that. A lot of them are political because you need the consent of either DPP or the Attorney General in order for a prosecution to be brought. But there's ways to challenge any refusal there. So yeah, that's something that definitely is achievable.
Any of the other panelists?
I think one of the geniuses of British colonialism and how it has moved into the recent moment is the committee form. Sending things to committee forever, and Blair is still running around after all the Collecott stuff, and nothing has happened to him. And that's actually really devastating. It's devastating to Iraqi communities that no one was held accountable for what happened. And in many ways, that war, if we think in the long term, opened up all the phases to what we see today. For a long time, civil servants now, actually, since the beginning of the genocide, have been getting in touch with us and saying, the information doesn't add up. The government isn't telling the truth. What can we do? And they've worked with their trade union, sometimes well, sometimes not so well, to try and say something is happening. I do think we can build the kind of movement where governments can be held accountable. I will cry so much if Lammy gets elected again in Tottenham. But we don't have the power right now to make sure that they're not elected. We still need to build the kind of movement that will hold them to account. I think we have the power to. I think the point of meeting today and a lot of the organizing we are doing is to transition to having governments that are actually accountable to the people. And building the kinds of movements and organizations that will help get us there. Do I feel we have the power today? Unfortunately, I'd say no. Do I think we can get there? I think with serious organizing, we really can, because there has been a real shaking up of people's faith in the government. Not people who are already like radicalized and critical, but people who are very new to politics, who would have never thought of themselves as political people, have seen that the government is not listening and what it's doing. So it's really up to all of us to think through and think about how do we build the kind of movement where these people aren't in charge of us making whatever random decisions they're making, not just for Palestine, but for the economy here as well. Just to circle back to the question around defense spending, this is about spending here. This is about the economy here. What kind of economy is being imagined? And what's being imagined is an economy based on defense, which essentially means the destruction of communities in other parts of the world. So jobs here will depend on the destruction of and scenes like what we have seen in Gaza over the past year happening all around the world. There's a way to imagine an economy that is not based on imperialism and the destruction of places around. And I think hopefully this is a good segue for the next panel that will speak to that topic.
Thank you.
I think that it just goes to show the illusion of Western democracy, that we have a government elected supposedly by the people that is committing war crimes against the will of the people, and the people have no power to stop it. The problem is that human beings have relatively short attention spans. Please don't forget, in a few years' time, what has happened in Gaza. Please continue to remember and stand up for it, because when the attention shifts elsewhere, things will resume again. Only if we remember, if we continue to educate, and if we continue to fight in this manner, will they ever actually be held to account.
On that note, I think we'll wrap up the panel. Can we give them a round of applause? I guess, thank you, and we will leave now. Hope you enjoy the next panel.
I think we're just waiting for Clive as well.
I thought I was going to have the stage to myself.
Do us all.
I don't know, because when you have the mic, you feel have the power. So I don't know if I want to share.
Thanks, everybody. We're going to get going. If you want to take a seat, get comfortable. Hello, everyone. My name is Liz McKean. I'm Director of Campaigns, Policy and Programmes at War on Want, so it's really nice to meet you all. And I've had some really nice chats with people already, so thank you very much for coming out on a warm, sunny afternoon. So welcome to this panel, Billionaires and Breadlines, the fight for economic justice. So I just want to give a few comments of introduction, really, before I introduce the panel today. For those of you who don't know War on Want too well or not too familiar with our work, you've just heard a fantastic panel discussion that talks about the issue of Palestine and the genocide against Palestinians. And this afternoon's panel, we're also talking about another key area of War on Want's work. We have a long history of campaigning for economic justice, always recognising that poverty is political. You might see that on some of our T-shirts that staff are wearing. Because we do believe and understand and recognise that poverty is a result of political decisions made by governments and powerful elites, corporations, people with power and wealth. And whether that's through policy like taxation, trade or social security or health or education or minimum wage laws, for example, but also structural issues around inequality and discrimination, and also through to resource allocation and decisions that are made about what and who matters the most. So we know as an organisation that the global economy, the global economic system is rigged in favour of wealthy elites and big corporations. Some of War on Want's work has been about exposing those injustices, for example, around corporation tax dodging. We've contributed to the likes of McDonald's facing over $1 billion in fines from the French court a few years back. And we're also part of a coalition in campaigning for more taxes on wealth in the UK and on big corporations. And we were outside Parliament with other organisations on Wednesday morning when the spending review was due out from government. So we know we're in a deepening crisis of economic inequality in the UK and globally. We've got some great speakers joining us today to share their insights and expertise. So I'm just going to quickly introduce the panel, and then I'm going to ask each person to give top line 5 minutes on your kind of perspectives on the economic system and injustices. And then I've got a question for each of you afterwards where we can do a bit of a deeper dive on some of the issues. So first of all, we have James Meadway. He's an economist and writer and host of the Macrodose podcast. Was advisor to Labour Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell. So thanks for joining us today, James. Dr. Carolina Alves, Associate Professor at University College London Institute for Innovation and Social Purpose. And before that, was a research fellow at Cambridge Uni on heterodox economics. Thank you for joining us. And we have Clive Lewis, MP for Norwich South. Clive's held a number of Labour shadow ministerial positions, including at the Treasury. So thank you again for joining us. And Alex Gordon, who's former president of the Rail, Maritime and Transport Union. So, first of all, just wondered if you could start us off, James, with your reflections for 5 minutes or so.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me here. I suppose there's a couple of things. The title for the session was Billionaires and Breadlines, and there's something very critical at the minute about the relationship between those two things that we have. I suppose it's the big picture part of it, that in the space of the last sort of decade, we've gone from a world which is the environment is basically kind of stable. If you live in the developed world, you would sort of sit there and things didn't seem too bad, right? You did not have to continually think that climate change was, in fact, an immediate presence in your life. And in the space of the last 5 years or so, that clearly isn't applying anymore. We've just gone through the driest spring in decades in this country. Rivers across Europe are the driest they've been also for decades by this point in the year. Extreme weather events multiply every single year that happens. And then, and this is the key to it, on a day-to-day basis, how we live our lives is disrupted by climate change in ways that often we would not have thought about. I think the environmental movement has done actually a really good job, and we don't often credit ourselves enough in this, in raising a level of sort of public awareness around what the science has very clearly been telling us all for some period of time. The outright climate denialism is something a minority pursuit by this point. You find a lot of the deniers have sort of switched into, well, there's this stuff happening, we don't really know the cause, or they switch into a kind of delayism, where you say, we don't have to do anything about it now, there's not much point. That's kind of where the argument tends to land. But there's a widespread public perception that climate change is happening, is real. But it tends to be on the level of saying, okay, this is the cataclysm that's going to turn up at some point in the future. Now, if you're in the global south, if you were in Pakistan a few years ago and you had absolutely devastating floods, the cataclysm was kind of already there. But if you're sitting in the global north, you could, in your heads, have an idea that climate change was going to be, I do not have to say I never really liked the film, but Don't Look Up, where it's as if a meteorite is going to turn up and destroy the planet. That's the kind of conception of climate change. Now, that is something that can happen, right? That is a kind of set of risks that might be out there. That could be what occurs. This is the danger that is built into the process of the climate changing and nature crisis and resource depletion. All of these things stack up like this. But on a day-to-day basis, what climate change really means is that olive oil, for instance, costs 150% more than it used to in the shops. Or the chocolate bars are hugely more expensive and much smaller than they used to be. Easter eggs have shrunk again this year. It's kind of pretty mundane, but it's all the time. And that grinds away at you all the time. And that's grinding away at you in some very particular things, which is food and energy, and increasingly you finding around the world water, where disputes over control and access to water are becoming a real serious problem. And for this country in particular, I think that's going to turn into a major flashpoint when you have a government that's committed to massively rolling out data centres across the whole country. These are, in the case of the biggest hyperscale data centres, that's a massive capital investment that will use about the same amount of energy and water as a town of 30 to 40,000 people. And you're going to stick these in parts of the country like Oxfordshire that are already water constrained. So there's a clear sort of dispute that's building in there. The fights in the last year in France, huge protests against the construction of about 20 megabassins, huge reservoirs across rural France, with the complaint that these were being built to support massive French agribusiness and not smaller farmers and local citizens. So there's a real sort of sets of disputes that are building in there. But the point about all this chaos is it's not just here is climate change arriving and it makes life a kind of more of a grind for people. That a major part of what we see as a cost of living crisis is actually the impact of climate change and the nature crisis bearing down on us. And increasingly, that's going to be the case. It's also that chaos and disruption and shortages are actually good for at least a few people out there. A report from Oxfam last year noted that with the surge in food prices over the last sort of 3-4 years or so, that has created 62 new, what they called food billionaires. These are people who own the limited number, and you're talking 4 or 5 major agribusinesses that control 70, 80, 90% of various different parts of the world agricultural system. And if you sit at the top of something that's essential that everyone has to buy, and you control that production, you control the supply of it, and there's a shortage, and the shortage is nothing really to do with you, it's climate change. That's what's disrupting agriculture all over the world. But if there's a shortage, you can do incredibly well out of that. So the fact that there is a cost of living crisis here because of climate change turns into a very few people doing exceptionally well because of climate change on the other side of that particular balance. So I suppose what we have to start thinking about in this is not just that, you can have a criticism for 30, 40 years now of neoliberalism, of the way capitalism is organised to make the wealthier wealthier and to reproduce inequality and worsen inequality on a huge scale. I think we now also need to reckon with the fact that the impact of climate change on a capitalist global economy is to reinforce inequality. It's to produce shortages in essentials that we have to pay more, and that money goes to someone, and it goes to the people who own the companies that produce the essentials. So you worsen inequality from this. So we don't just have to talk about redistribution or wealth tax. We also have to talk about the redesign of our essential systems, like how do we produce and grow and sell food? How do we reward the people who are doing that, actually doing this, not the people sitting at the top of the companies? How do we manage water effectively? Because fairly obviously terms, water isn't the best way to do that. Is it a good idea to build data centers in places that are already experiencing drought so that Microsoft or whoever it might be can make the profits from that and create no local jobs? No, it is not. That we have to get into a conversation about how we organize the essentials of life, because this is where the impacts of climate change are appearing. And for as long as those production systems are organized in a capitalist way, climate change means more inequality, and it means a worsening cost of living crisis for most people. Until we change that, until we do the redistribution and the redesign of those systems, we suffer from both of these impacts.
Thank you, James. Yeah, Carolina.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, James, and thank you everyone for being here and for inviting me. I have some notes, can't speak like James, but be glad I don't have a PowerPoint. So, so my intervention will be a little bit more on the economic justice part in Breadlines, which I think is going to go very well with what James has just said about redesign, right? So what we have since, at least documented very well since the 1980s, is an increase in inequality around the globe. And that has been accepted, especially in the more, let's say, the heterodox side of economics, but also in developing countries. This was open, very visible for everyone. But it wasn't too very recent that the discussion of inequality, the discussion of increasing inequality became more common in the policy and in economics as a discipline in economics discussion, especially in developed economies. And we can go through many reasons for that, but sadly, one of the main reasons is a book that was published in 2014 from Thomas Piketty, which I assume many of you may be familiar with it, called Capital in the First 20th Century. By the way, the book's very thick, but there's a version, not by Piketty, called Pocket Piketty, which is like this. I always give that to my students. It's as good as the other one. Oh, this is being recorded, okay. So forget it, I said that. But yeah, so the discussion that Piketty, the way he wrote with the economic terms, so it was accepted by the economic profession, so everybody started discussing that. And of course, what was happening in the US in 2016 and 17 in terms of cuts, tax cuts that would increase the wealth of the top 10% to 1%, also kind of fomented the discussion of inequality. And it became more acceptable to talk about it, to study. And of course, now after Brexit here, pandemic, and and since we are in this historical moment where the world has been turned into like a pool of war led by, I don't know, sociopaths, so I think things will just get worse. But from where I see it, and I know I'm in a very privileged position as academic and teaching economics, that's why I'm really happy to be here to feel more useful in a way. The way I see is most of this discussion has been about documenting inequality, showing that inequality exists, right? To go there and have the data, which then it has credibility. But one thing that I can't see that happening at the economic level, academic research, but also the policy level goes towards what James was saying in terms of redesign, right? So we can now challenge the centrist, the liberal, that would say, no, capitalism is the best, progress, and etc. So now they can't say that so easily. They have to acknowledge, yeah, there is that thing, that's kind of a little problem called inequality. So of course this is there, but we are not thinking in terms of what is driving inequality, what is the cause of inequality. Yes, sorry, Clive, I had to do that, yeah, sorry. So, of course, we have Piketty saying to us, for example, that the returns in capital is much larger than what the economy is producing. We can go back to tax and distribution. We can talk about the lack of strong institutions, which has been something that the Global North is telling to the Global South for the last 100 years. We can also talk about corruption. But the reality is, why we're not going back to discuss capitalism and its dynamics, right? In a more realistic way, what's happening? Why we can't get rid of inequality, of poverty? What is happening here? Why you don't stop seeing inequality as this kind of accidental outcome. So in the world of economic disciplines, most of the problems from inequality to climate change to pandemic, they are seen as external to the economy, right? I don't know how familiar are you with economics, but that's the way we teach, which is called under this kind of general equilibrium approach. So everything is imperfection, externality. And you can see that in the newspaper, 2007-8 crisis, a financial shock. Loss, especially in the UK, the loss of productivity shock. COVID-19, public health shock. It's always this shock in the economy. You don't think within why this shock, why it's more normal to have the shocks than not. But we just feel like it's happening, it's here. And then that leaves us with not many tools, theoretical, methodological, but also the policy level, to trying to get rid of poverty. We react to it. And I'm not saying that taxes or going after tax and improve tax system, I'm not saying that's not important, but that is already a reaction to something, right? So I think this is what I see that's missing in a discussion of how we understand this economy. And the last thing I'm gonna do, perhaps a lot of this discussion may sound a bit abstract, but the reality is we can document that inequality is increasing as much as we can, right? And that has become a part of the mainstream discourse. But the reality is if you don't change our tools, if you don't change how we are conceptualizing the economy or how we want to redesign the economy, we're not going to be able to move forward. So I think this is the main message I want to say. Like, we still, at least in economics level and the policy level, we still have to go back and challenge that mode of production we are part of, and go back to discuss value, the creation of value, not just the distribution of value, and so on. So I think this is my main message for now.
Thank you, Carolina. So, Clive.
Thank you. And again, it's a real pleasure to be here. Labour MPs don't get invited to progressive things like this very often. So, again, I'll start with two apologies. Firstly, for being a Labour MP. I seem to be doing that quite a lot at the moment. In fact, I was speaking to someone earlier here, I won't name them, and happened to say, are you still a member of the Labour Party? And he was, shh, yes. So, yeah, and I think we can come on to that in a second in terms of what I talk about. And secondly, my other apology is that half of my economic ideas, or 2/3 of them, come from James and Macro Dose. So the fact he's on the panel is a kind of a bummer, because half of what I talk about is often what I've heard or listened to or read from James. Because, as you can tell, he's got some very good ideas and he's very good at explaining them. And if you don't listen to Macro Dose, I'll do the plug for him. You should. Even though he was being heckled by his own child at the beginning of the meeting. So one of the things that I think that people... I want to try and focus a little bit on the UK. And I think what's happening in the UK is endemic of what's happening around the world. And I think if you look at what's happened here, we've just elected a Labour government. And whilst I don't believe Labour governments have been perfect, by and large, they are meant to make an appreciable difference to how the economy is run and who it works for. And yet, at the moment, I don't think most of us in this room would have any confidence when it comes to tackling the core issues behind billionaires and breadlines, between the deep and extreme wealth inequalities that we see in this country and around the world, that this is a Labour government that seems to have its finger on the pulse, the policy pulse, of what it needs to do. We've just had a comprehensive spending review, which has spent lots of money. They've released that they've kind of adjusted the fiscal rules to spend lots of money, predominantly in the form of corporate welfare. And if you think about where that money's going to go, it's going to go mainly to big tech, developers, even potholes. I happen to do a little bit of research. Most of the top 5 companies, organisations that fix the potholes, the £2.4 billion that the government has now announced for potholes, will go to 5 of the largest road building corporations in the world. That's things like BlackRock and Qatar, the Qatari investment fund. So the money that we spend as a government in the comprehensive spending review, much of that will be going to line the pockets of corporations, big business, and the dividend payouts to the shareholders. And I think that's something we need to understand, because what we're not spending the money on is on what James has repeatedly called social reproduction. That's on the things that actually matter. The things that actually the Spanish socialist government under Sanchez are doing. They're calling it the social shield. They're investing in education, in health, on giving people rental rights, on environmental protections. They're doing the bits that actually are going to make a difference to people as the climate crisis bites, and trying to level up the vast majority of the population in Spain who are suffering the effects, quite real in Spain, of the climate crisis. You'd have heard about the droughts and so on. So it does show what's possible. But I think what we have now at the moment is a Labour government that is failing, if not refusing, to tackle the key issues. I'm in a joint party with another MP, and one of the things that this other MP, who's on the new intake, frequently does is they frequently say, it's really unfair, Clive, what you're saying about the Labour government, of all the good things that we're doing. And you have to admit, there are things, for example, like Ed Miliband's Warm Homes package, 13.6 or 13.5 billion pounds to upgrade homes, make them warmer, solar panels, air and ground source heat pumps. There's some good stuff going on, but when you look at the sheer scale of what's coming at us, it's like issuing the public a pair of goggles for a tsunami that's heading your way. It's simply inadequate, and we should be doing so much more. One of the things I've been doing at the moment is I've been running a campaign on water and water ownership. I hope some of you might have seen it. The reason that I chose water, because I think it shows really clearly to the public, and I think the public understand it, in a real visceral way, about how the climate crisis and how about late-stage capitalist greed is beginning to have an impact, or has and is having an impact on their lives. So you may have heard that, I'm not the only one. Reform UK now has a policy for mutualised water ownership. I was actually stood next to Richard Tice when he told myself and an academic who was launching Unison's Bring Water Back into Public Ownership at the Commons. And he came sidled up to me and he said, Clive, do you realise that Reform now has a policy for the mutualisation of public water, unlike Labour, which still wants to keep it in private hands? And I have to admit, I was absolutely shocked for a few seconds until I realised, well, of course they're going to do this, because the public understand instinctively what's going on. So often in the climate movement, we have raised awareness. James, I think you were right on that. We have raised awareness, but we still need to make it visceral. And water does that, because people drink water, they swim in it, they bathe in it. We know that we need it to grow crops. Water is something that everyone needs, and yet they've all seen their bills go up massively. And they all understand the absolute rinsing that we've taken from the private corporations that have been running our water. 60 billion they've racked up in debt to pay out 72 billion pounds in dividend payments, plus all of the pollution. And on top of that, they've been paying out massive bonuses to the management of the companies, and at the same time telling the public that they're going to have to pay higher bills to fix the problems that they've created over the years. So I think one of the things that we need to be doing about how to bring the public with us is finding those issues which resonate with the public. Reform UK have done that. What's my government's response to this issue, which really kind of brings together all the threads of inequality, runaway corporate welfare, pollution, the environment, the climate crisis? My government's proposals so far are to basically regurgitate some legislation from 5 or 6 years ago on apparently making sure that executives go to prison. I can tell you what, no one's going to go to prison, and you may have seen with Thames Water, they have now I don't want to make this about water, but I want to very quickly say this, they have now issued a ransom note to the British government saying that if you want us to bail Thames Water out, we will face no criminal action. We will do nothing as regards to the environmental pollution that we've committed, and you'll like it. That's where the British government finds itself at the moment. And I think if we're going to tackle this, and I think hopefully we'll come on to this a little bit later, we're going to have to acknowledge the crisis of democracy that confronts us. There is a crisis of democracy. It's driven by climate. It's driven by greed and inequality. And it is driving our economy, it is driving our democracy towards authoritarianism. I say driving it towards authoritarianism. I think we're already well down that road, if I'm honest. But that's the direction it's traveling in. And the only way, and I will finish by saying this, the only way I feel that we'll be able to tackle and do what's needed is by deepening democracy. What do I mean by that? Well, one of the things that you would have heard from the 18th century in the United States and the Revolution was no taxation without representation. And one of the things we're going to need to do is we are going to need to fundamentally re-tax, not just wealth, I think that's critically important, but there's also some income in there as well that I think is going to need to be taxed. But people aren't going to accept more taxation. They're not going to accept more tax on income. They're not going to accept more tax from their pay packets unless they feel they have a real stake in our society. They have a real stake in the things that make a difference to their lives, on water, on energy, on the things that we need to live, making sure that we actually have a say over our children's education, over housing. And that means a kind of renewal of our democratic system. At the moment, what we're seeing with devolution, we're seeing, in effect, mayors who are going to be strong men. There's little accountability there, little democratic accountability. We're going to have to push democracy down, and then we're going to have a proper conversation about how we're going to tackle the inequality that is endemic within our society. Without that, then I see little way forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Clive. I'm just going to bring Alex now in for your top line thinking, if that's okay.
Okay, thanks, Liz. And it's, again, pleasure to be here. And I came in during the last panel discussion and heard people talking about the arms industry. And I think this really feeds into what the other panelists are talking about. The reason why Breadline Britain doesn't appreciate the £13.5 billion that Ed Miliband is spending on renewable improvements to renewable energy and home insulation is because what they hear from this government is the Strategic Defence Review. What they hear from this government is that we're going to increase the proportion of GDP that we spend on military procurement from 2% to 2.5% in this parliament, to 3%, to 2.7% in the following parliament. We hear Trump and Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, saying that the expectation now is that member states should spend 3.5% of GDP, not 2.5%, not 2.7%, not 3%, but 3.5%, plus another 1.5% in essential infrastructure spending, making a total of 5% of GDP. So this escalator, this up escalator of expectations that's being set for us by these very loud, very prominent voices that dominate the media narrative are not going to allow tinkering with home insulation to break through as a political narrative. And if you look at where this is leading Breadline Britain, you can see where the money is being spent. You're quite right, as I think it was Clive or it might have been Carolina said, that the spending is going into big tech, armaments companies. That's where the billionaires are getting funded. That's what the Strategic Defence Review was about when Blair launched it in Govan. The conceit that was being pronounced by Blair when he launched the SDR in Govan, one of the poorest areas of Glasgow, was that this was going to help, this additional expenditure was going to help local people in the East End of Glasgow. None of the people in the arms factory where he was, the BAE Systems arms factory where he was launching the SDR, the Strategic Defence Review, live in Govan. And most of them don't work in Govan, they were brought in for the photo op, but they certainly don't live in Govan. CND, which I'm a member of, has recently been up to Barrow-in-Furness to do a protest outside the nuclear submarine building plant there, talking to local people about the impact of that plant on their lives, their health, their economy. And what's very clear is that local people in Barrow-in-Furness, contrary to the narrative that is spun by government Ministry of Defence spin doctors, contrary to that, Those people do not feel benefited by, they don't feel rich, they don't feel wealthy because of this enormous industry on their doorsteps. The same would be true of somewhere like Plymouth, Devonport, where many of the nuclear subs and Royal Navy fleet are maintained. This doesn't enrich the local community. If you're wealthy enough and skilled enough to work in a job where you maintain nuclear submarines, you might, if you're a local, live somewhere in the Lake District. You don't live in Barrow-in-Furness. You might live somewhere up on Dartmoor or some nice part of Devon. You don't live in Devonport. So there's this complete fallacy that is being spun that all of this money is going to be an engine of growth, an engine of jobs, and we've heard those very words used by John Healey, the Defence Secretary this year. I mean, he announced in January £9 billion worth of expenditure in Derby for Rolls-Royce engines. But again, this is not going to transform jobs, or what this actually is doing is crowding out, to use a term that George Osborne used in 2010 when the Cameron Osborne austerity budgets came in. They claimed that public expenditure crowded out private investment. Of course, what's really happening here is that our money, our public money, is being spent in the arms industry to finance big tech and finance big arms companies, most of which are majority US capitalized companies. Even BAE Systems is majority share ownership, is not British, it's American. Instead of spending that money on the essential shield that you're talking about, that the Spanish government is talking about, renewing our Victorian transport infrastructure, renewing our Victorian housing stock or our 1950s housing stock. This is where the money needs to go. You won't hear that narrative coming through because it's been crowded out.
Thank you, Alex. I've got a couple of follow-up questions, if that's okay with the panel, and then we'll go to the floor for questions. I'll try and keep an eye on, I haven't got a watch, but I'll try and keep an eye on the time from someone. So it's really interesting that one of the things that's really coming through is actually we need to be looking at, you called it a redesign, James, a transformation, a complete rethinking of what the economy is there for. So one of the questions I've got for you, James, is where do we start with that? How can we, where do we organise ourselves around that? Where's the starting point? Because while we're all looking at kind of realising we need that transformation, we're also looking at campaigning so things don't get worse, so decisions aren't made that make things worse, or practical things that we can see in front of us coming from the government that we can respond to. How do we balance that kind of need for, immediate campaigning on concrete things whilst actually fighting that bigger fight for the transformation?
Okay, I mean, a couple of things in that. One of them is that what we've had, if I think back over the last 10 years or so, like take the period from the financial crisis, we know that wealth inequality was a problem, and we'd had lots of demands around like ending austerity and spending more money. And if you think about what Jeremy Corbyn, as leader of the Labour Party, was standing for, was ending austerity, and government can spend more money and we don't have to sort of put up with this. Austerity was a political choice rather than necessity, all of which was right. But in some ways we had it kind of, it's going to sound strange to say this, but unfortunately I think it's true, we had it relatively easy. That if you have relatively low inflation and you have relatively all-time low, actually, interest rates, the government can go off and borrow a lot of money and spend a lot of money, and you don't actually have to do something more fundamental about the distribution of power and wealth in this country to get to the point where you end austerity, like 5-10 years ago. So Labour's programme during that period of time was basically actually pretty mild in terms of what it would say about inequalities of wealth. There was no wealth tax sitting in Labour's manifesto at the time. And there was a big promise of borrowing to spend on all sorts of things across the whole country, and a pledge to end austerity in the back of that. And you could do all of that because it was relatively benign economic conditions. It was miserable for most people here. Like the insanity of what we were doing is that instead of seeing this opportunity out of the end of the financial crisis and saying, interest rates are low, we can borrow and invest on a colossal scale, we can rebuild the entire country. We had governments that committed themselves to doing the exact opposite, which was tearing things down and imposing cuts. Right? It was absolutely mad to do this, and we have to live with those consequences for a long period of time. We're now in quite a different state of the world. Right? Growth is dwindling away. You might have seen the World Bank forecast revised downwards, for example, just out this week, that we have to deal with the reality of climate change and resource constraints and this sort of thing, and we still have all the inequality. And if you stack all of that up, you have to start with addressing the problem of wealth inequality front and centre. And I really do want to pay tribute to Gary Stevenson and the patriotic millionaires and the other people who've been campaigning on this in particular, who've done a really good job of hammering that message, that it starts from this question of redistribution, which is now unavoidable. We don't have any choice on this. If you want to say, how do we make things better here, we are going to have to address the inequality to make things better. That if you're living in a low-growth society, a low-growth world, and that's what we're getting into, redistribution and wealth redistribution starts to become the primary concern. And not just within a country, you have to think about what are we going to do to try and get the rest of the world in the global south, which is being hammered even more by climate change. You know, parts of India, parts of sub-Saharan Africa rapidly becoming uninhabitable due to climate change. Where is their development going to come from without redistribution? It's not going to happen at all. So you have to have this question front and centre. So you start with wealth inequality, I think. The conclusion, the next steps along from that is, okay, what do you do with the money you're raising? In this country, I think, as Carolina touched on it, and Clive mentioned it, it's like absolutely, the government we have has done this peculiar thing that no other Labour government has done, which is not increase spending, because even New Labour did it quite a lot, on like the health service dramatically, education somewhat, and a load of other bits of the welfare state. It's not doing that. It's spending a lot of money on, as Clive pointed out, it's capital investments, big things in the rest of the country, but it's money that goes to big developers in the first instance. It is not spending money on, for example, social care. It's not spending enough money on education. It's not spending enough money in the NHS, even though there's a bit more money going into it. It's not spending enough money, certainly, on public health. It's just missing all these things out. And if you live in an aging society where more people need those services, if you live in a society that's been hit by climate change and people need that kind of care and protection, this is what you spend money on first. It's not like building big new things elsewhere in the country. You have to get this right as well. So that, I think, is one of the key demands here, that demand for more care expenditure, for more attention being paid to what the care economy looks like and the people who work in it. How do we make sure people who are doing this work are paid properly and paid effectively, and not, as we've seen, just financialisation and private equity funds taking over half the sector and these sort of rip-off merchants you get investing social care in this country. That is one of the key demands I think I start to think about in Britain in particular.
Thank you. Carolina, just following on from what James was saying, just wondered if you got any thoughts on how we actually challenge the dominant narratives on the economy at the moment. Where are our best entry points for sort of looking at this, as opposed to what's actually driving the economy and the issues around inequality? If you've got any further thoughts to share.
This is a tough one. That's not fair. Yeah, I mean, I think how we start that. I think each of us is interesting because we have a panel. We have a politician. Can I say you're a politician, right? You have a politician, academic, a trade union, a public intellectual, and I think each of us would give a different answer of how to tackle this narrative in economics. But perhaps to make the link with what James is saying, for example, in a traditional economic narrative, we deal with something which is the balanced budget, which UK went really far with the fiscal rule. That's this number that no one knows why it exists, how we calculate it, but here we go, it's there. And sadly, it's spreading around the world. Brazil is talking now about having a fiscal rule. But anyway, let's not go there. So I think there is something about how we challenge this narrative of budget. I agree with what, for example, at the concrete level, to tackle inequality, we need to do all the things that James has already said. Right, and many of you in this room may say, this then is a political matter, and you have to go that road to challenge that. But at the same time, these policymakers and politicians will be relying on a set of tools that would act as a straitjacket around them regarding where they can spend the money and, of course, where this money will come from. So there is this question of, for example, care in this more traditional framework of economics is seen as expenditure, right? Not as investment. Why? Because investment in economics terms, something that you can calculate the yield in a very tangible way. So investing in infrastructure or whatever. So there is a point of tackling this narrative, for example, to go back to what James is saying of what counts as expenditure and perhaps what Clive was saying before that Spain is doing. I wonder what's the rationale, how they're getting away with that in economic terms to create this, how you call, they're calling the the social shield. So how we turn things upside down and perhaps the social shield becomes the investment, which, by the way, there are more and more studies now showing that to tackle the problem of productivity, which is a problem in the UK, is much more towards that line of care than anything else, than, this investment in AI. I'm looking to you because you're labor, so I have to do this. So, the thing is, I think, so these, for example, very specific terms, of course, they can go on for many other aspects of economics we can challenge, but to join, kind of make the link with this concrete aspect, what you have to do to tackle inequality in the terms that James is saying, I would say we should find a way. And the thing is, find a way is, and that's perhaps the part as academic we have to play, but also educators in any level. For example, the way we teach the sixth forms, students in the UK as well, what is economics is also awful. It's still the same kind of economics. So the question is how we equip these students, these academics that will occupy positions of power, especially my students in Cambridge, they all go for the government economic service, or some of them go direct to positions of even more power. And, but that's their mentality, right? The mentality is we can't spend. And the thing is, I used to think there are just a bunch of neoliberal that don't care, but actually, some of them, they do care, but they can't see how the tools they have restricted them. So as someone teaching them, what I want is just to give them the tools that they can be creative. So I think the bar is so low that I just want to teach them everything I can for them to be creative. And one thing I could do in that very specific aspect is to show, and I'm not reinventing the wheel, there are so many other different theories that move us away from this fiscal rule, from the balanced budget approach. At least teach these students that exists, because right now, most of our students, I would say, well, from 25 onwards, that's what they get. So how we can expect, I'm not defending them, but in a way, how we can expect any creativity, although, with exception of the OBR, because I think the average age there is probably 100 years. So that is a problem, they just need new people. But in other parts of the government, we need just to teach. I mean, that's my aspect as academic. I know people say, like, that's too abstract. And also come here and perhaps, do the other part we can do. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm actually going to go to Clive next because, so that's really interesting when you talk about teaching the kind of new generation of economists and decision makers coming forward. If we were to have a government that had more focus on justice issues, what do you think they would be doing and should be doing towards economic transformation? It's a bit biggie that, but maybe some concrete ideas.
Yeah, it is a biggie. So, I mean, I think it's already been discussed. It's very popular at the moment, but it clearly, one of the key things would be a wealth tax, an effective series of wealth taxes, the ability to be able to redistribute that wealth around the economy and to put it where it's actually needed, it could do some good. I think some of the other things which are kind of, people will go, well, why would he say that? But I think some of it, and I will keep banging on, about democracy. And one of the things that we can see within our economic system, within our governance, is the failure of democracy. I see it everywhere, from the internal democracy of the Labour Party through into the lack of economic democracy on everything from, if your child goes to an academy, you have absolutely no say no say over your child's education. They can simply, and I have seen it happen in Norwich and Norfolk, dismantle whatever governing body that has parents or local community members, they just get rid of it and put a new one in that will do what they want. So every aspect of our lives, people feel that there's a lack of control. And I think there has been a breakdown, the social compact, when you want to call it the post-war social compact, but there is now a distinctive lack of trust between the vast majority, I would say, of the public and the political class and the political system. It isn't working. It's working for some people, clearly. Some corporations, the wealthy, they're doing very well. And actually, they're now, the feedback mechanisms, they're now actually, if you look at the US and Elon Musk and the other billionaires, they're now influencing our democracy. They're making it more autocratic, more authoritarian. They are pushing money into it. They're even writing books about the post-democratic system. That's how out there they are about it. So I think we can talk about wealth taxes. We can talk about doing the things, a kind of a manifesto, a dream manifesto of all the things we want to do. But you can't do that without real power. And to have real power, you need public consent in a democracy. And to have public consent, you need to have public trust. And to have public trust, people need to feel that they are actually going to, if you say, okay, we are going to cause, the Daily Mail, the right-wing media, the billionaires, X, they are going to be screaming at this government for doing this. But if you trust us, then, we can work our way through that. Why will people trust you? Because you are giving them more power and more say over their lives. You're giving them more say over their children's education. You're giving them more say over local government. You're giving them more say over water, over energy, over the decisions that are made that affect their lives. You're rebuilding trust. And unless you do that, you're not going to be able to do all the things you want to do, because the people with that wealth and power aren't just going to go, oh, yeah, well, I've had it really good for so far, so it's your turn now. We'll give some of that back. We'll give some of this power or this wealth back to you. It's not going to happen. Now, I'm not a revolutionary in the sense that revolutions often tend to be violent, and the seed of that violence then kind of perpetrates on through and through. That's one take on it. But I do believe that there needs to be a revolution, a democratic revolution, in how we take back control within our economy. And I think that is how you then begin to do the other economic things you need to do to take power and wealth away from those who have it. The final thing I will say is I think there has to be, in a democracy, one of the key things in a democracy is the information system, how people make informed choices. And that clearly doesn't exist within our democracy. It's not just our media, it's now our social media, it's now the platforms on which we get the majority of our information. These things shape our reality. They tell us what's acceptable, what is unacceptable. I mean, one of the things, I read this from Dominic Cummings made a speech. Go and listen to it. It's terrifying, but it's really revealing. Gramsci said, the most difficult arguments of your opponents are those that have a kernel of truth at their heart. And as you read what he's saying, you're like, well, I actually agree with that. I actually think that's right. But it's where the conclusions he comes to, which I find very difficult and quite unnerving. But one of the things he said, and I think it's striking, and it relates to something you were saying, was he said this. Do you remember, and I remember this, I remember when we were being told about Russia, all of the media, all of the social media was saying, Russia will not be able to take these sanctions. Russia will implode. Russia will get weaker. It will not be able to maintain this war against the West. And it will lose. Now we're being told this war has made Russia stronger. Russia is now building a war economy that can challenge the rest of Europe and the US. We must be frightened. We must now increase our defense spending. My God, it's Orwellian. And you don't know whether you're coming or you're going. So clearly, the democratic mechanism to which we make our decisions as democracy also need to be looked at in great detail, media ownership and the platforms that we have and receive that information on. But yeah, those are some of the things I would look at.
Thank you. Just picking up on the defence point, I'll go straight to Alex because I know you've been involved in the Alternative Defence Review. If you could share a little bit of that before we go to questions. Thank you.
I'd be delighted to. How like when you're on a panel, you always want to answer the question that the person just before you answered. And I just want to say on the question of democracy that Clive's, and I agree with much of what you're saying, it has to be said that Breadline Britain, Breadline and Billionaires, what you've got is the biggest level of inequality in this country that we've ever seen. The easiest way to address that rising level of inequality is through collective bargaining, using earned income through wages collectively to address the falling ratio of profit that is going into wages and which has been falling for decades in this country. And currently in the House of Commons, well, currently in the House of Lords, but shortly coming back to the House of Commons, we have the Employment Rights Bill, which is the fruit of long negotiations between the trade union movement and the Labour Party, which initially in the 2017 Corbyn manifesto was set out mandatory sectoral collective bargaining has been completely gutted of any reference whatsoever to sectoral collective bargaining. There will be two sectors in which there will be consultation over terms and conditions for workers. That is adult social care and school workers, school support staff in England and Wales. Everywhere else, there is no sectoral collective bargaining. You cannot address inequality democratically in this country without trade unions. And I don't want to go back to the conversation that was on the previous panel about the reasons for the secular decline of trade unionism, but the decline of collective bargaining is the core reason. And until we get a real Employment Rights Act, which includes mandatory sectoral collective bargaining, we're not going to be able to address inequality. On the Alternative Defence Review, thank you for mentioning it. It's just been published last week by a working group set up by the RMT Union and CND. It's available on CND's website. It's a demolition. It was written before the publication of the government's Strategic Defence Review, but we predicted correctly what was going to be in the SDR. It's a demolition of the arguments that you'll find in the SDR. There aren't that many arguments. And what we've tried to set out is where this war narrative that Clive has just referred to, where it came from. We think it's clear at which point the British state fastened on that narrative. It was when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, and there's a particular militarist wing within the Conservative Party, which we don't need to dwell on too much here. But at that point, when they started talking about global Britain and Britain's ability to project itself into the South China Sea using its military power, its military might to impress China. At that point, we started careering down this crazy path. And where it's left us now is with the Strategic Defence Review coming out with a promise of spending £1.5 billion of public money on creating 6 factories, which they claim are going to employ 1,000 workers. That's about £1.5 million a worker. I mean, what are they doing? Gold-plating cruise missiles. It's absolutely obscene. And the level of, larceny from the public purse in this process is something that we've tried. We think this narrative can be unpicked, and importantly, an alternative has to be put to trade unions and to workers, because you won't win the argument with trade unions by moral arguments. You will win it by explaining to big unions like Unite and GMB, who organise a small minority in their membership of people who work in the armaments industry, and whose massive majority of whose members work in the public sector or work in socially useful jobs. And when they get the message that the reason they can't have pay rises, the reason they're having their jobs cut, and the reason why their pensions are being stolen from them is because this government has decided to spend that money on BAE systems, is when we will change the argument inside the trade union movement. So we've got to be hard-headed about this, and I say this to the friends, comrades who were speaking earlier from workers in Palestine. That's the argument we've got to attack in the trade union movement. We've got to make it absolutely clear that workers in this country are not benefiting from this military Keynesian model that is being flogged to them. And we've really got to expose it.
Thanks, Alex. Right. We're a little bit pressed for time, but I want to open up to just do one round of questions. So if you could keep your questions as brief as possible, that would be brilliant. See one hand up over there, one at the front. I'll take you second. And then one over in the corner there. Okay.
Hello. Hi. So my question's around making the case for global economic justice and reforming the global economy that currently accelerates the climate crisis, traps countries in poverty. It feels as if the conversation has shifted, and we've had Keir Starmer and David Lammy and others talk about the fact that they want to make the global financial system function better for the most climate vulnerable and poorest countries, but action doesn't seem to be following. And when I'm, speaking to the government, trying to advocate for this, what they say is, well, there's no evidence that that our constituents care, essentially. We're not in the era of make poverty history when there were millions of people taking to the streets and demanding action for poor countries. We're now in a situation where the government feel that actually defence spending over aid spending is hugely popular. How do we build that argument?
Okay, thanks for that. I'm just going to go to one person on the panel first, and then we'll go to the next question. But I don't know who's best to answer that. Maybe Clive, might be. I don't know. Anybody else? Unless anybody's got a burning. Oh. Do you want to have a go at that one?
I mean, unlike everyone here, I can really get in trouble for what I say, but it needs to be said. I mean, the world has changed since those demonstrations and things took place. Things have got worse here. We are in the midst of, we keep calling it late-stage capitalism. I'm not sure what comes after, but we're not in a great place. I just feel, in terms of what David Lammy or Keir Starmer, my foreign secretary and my prime minister, they're in government with me, I suppose, is do you believe anything they say on this issue, in the sense that these are people who cannot call a genocide, who cannot call out ethnic cleansing, who cannot bring themselves to stop providing components for F-35s, who will not impose economic sanctions. So therefore, anything that comes out of their mouths about improving the well-being of people because of a climate crisis, being exacerbated by the fact they're about to spend extra billions on one of the most carbon-intensive sectors on the planet, I just kind of feel, we just have to kind of accept where we are. I think Greta Thunberg summed it up. She was asked, and I have been grappling with the question, and when she answered it, I was like, well, of course she's right. She said, well, why aren't they doing more? Why aren't they doing more in Gaza? And Gaza, in many ways, is reflective of helping people in sub-Saharan Africa, in the subcontinent in India, and all around all the parts of the world where we can see the environmental and ecological collapse taking place most comprehensively. And the reality is, she says, it's racism. There's a hierarchy of life. That's one part of it. And the rest is the global world order and profit. And that's pretty much it. And so I think, ultimately, anything that David or Keir says has to be seen in the light of that reality. So I probably wouldn't have said that to a journalist, but I've said it to this audience, so there you go.
Thank you. This is a question I've been spending more and more time on, because in the last 5 years, there is so much. The word global south, the word global has been, it's part of everything we've been discussing. And quite honestly, very often, more often than I'd like to, it's not clear what that really means for me. And I think that global economic justice, the way I see what we have nowadays at the international level, the Bretton Woods institutions, or how we organize our economic and trade system, is very much driven and oriented and structured to favor a handful number of countries, right? Especially because of what we call the dollar hegemony. And the way that was put in place was after the Second World War, when indeed the situation was one that many politicians around the globe took a seat as like, we need to organize that. We don't have that context, although is a pretty bad context as well. So what I've been spending time is, because to me what you have to challenge is, at the financial/money level, is the hegemony of dollar, and how we have these international institutions, how we think about international institutions, and together with that, especially in the context of climate change, how we think about this legacy of how we understand economic growth in some countries in the Global South will be able to develop in the context of a green industrial energy. So I think what that demands is a collective thinking at international level of how we do this, and I can't see that happens. The same with the international financial and monetary system. At the left, in movements like this, there are so many good people thinking of how we can reorganize that. But because of the geopolitics, I'm very pessimistic that it will happen. It happens when UK or Great Britain lost its power at the international level with the sterling. It was a context when, after the Second War, and the US had so much power. That's not the context, not that I want the power to go back to sterling. Nothing against Britain, but just to have something more equal international level. So I can't see that happening. So I think, to me, there are perhaps two aspects, right? At economic and financial and money level, what we're going to do with the dollar hegemony, which to me has, although people are challenging that Trump is making us a favor, and he's the one who's going to make that collapse, I just wonder how we can do that in a context of something James has already mentioned, which is financialization, where a lot of the gains we have in the economy now come from buying financial assets, and very often they are denominated in dollar. So I can't see how we're going to challenge that, which also one of the drives of inequality in the UK is the asset price inflation. So I don't know, how are we going to do this? Maybe strategically organizing ourselves at the international level, I don't know. But the other point is, what history has taught us is that every time we're trying to have an international system that was a little bit fairer, right, you end up really badly, especially for countries of the Global South. Most of them, like all the coups we have in Congo, in other countries, dictatorships in Latin America, every time we're trying to have a more international or internationalism in that economic context, it ended up really badly for these countries in the Global South. So yeah, sorry, I've been thinking about it, so
if you could be quick, James, and then we'll take the last two questions.
I will be really quick, because I don't want to have to disagree with Carolina, but I also thought maybe just some degree of optimism in this, because I have quite a different take. Look, these are the last years of dollar hegemony. Right, this thing is on the way out. This is not going to last much longer from this point onwards. And the way to understand what Donald Trump is doing is that this is an attempt by the US regime to kind of deal with that state of affairs, which is why they talk about America first, which is why Scott Bessent, the US Treasury Secretary, says we want to reorder the world economy. Yeah, they're fighting something of a losing battle here against the rest of the world, which is no longer organized as if America is the absolutely dominant power in the world and what it says goes, like we've seen for 20 odd years now that this isn't happening. Most recently, by the way, when Donald Trump had to do a deal with the Houthi movement, if anybody spotted that about a month or two ago. These are the people armed with 2,000-pound drones managed to beat the US Fifth Fleet and all its little helpers bobbing around in the Red Sea. So this is the end of dollar hegemony. This is what it looks like. And as that is ending, there are alternative ways of organizing the world that are starting to bubble up very quickly. The first agreement internationally on a levy for climate change was passed just over 2 months ago now by the International Maritime Organization, which is basically any ship sailing around the world over a certain weight, as of 2026, will have to pay a fee depending on how much greenhouse gases it emits. It's not enough, but the agreement is there. America walked out. America said, anybody passes this, we will sanction. And the rest of the world went, doesn't really matter. Led by a bunch of global south countries in this instance, China and Brazil in particular, the ones who switched how that deal went. We don't need to worry so much about what America does. There are different ways of organizing internationally now when you're faced with a power that is in a state of some decline. And that, I think, is a point of optimism. It's terrifying because the world is being shaken up and you don't know where it's going to land. But the world is being shaken up and you don't know where it's going to land. So there's something to hold on to there.
Okay, thank you. I'm really sorry, I've been told we've got no time for any more questions. I'm really sorry, but maybe we can huddle as we come off the stage and have a chat there. I'm really sorry. But just to end very quickly, thank you very much to all of our panels for giving a big clap.
I thought you were going to talk about the facilities track.
Yeah, sorry to cut off the further questions there. I'm the one who's telling everyone we've run out of time. So apologies for that. But can we have another round of applause for our panelists from this session and our panelists from this morning's sessions as well. And it's only a good sign that people are upset that it's finished, so hopefully we'll continue to engage with these topics, reach out to our speakers, and continue to have these discussions. But next, we're going to hear from our outgoing Executive Director, Asad Rahman, as I'm sure you've all heard he's leaving. And I guess after all these years, it's quite hard to imagine War on One without Assad in charge. And of course, his departure leaves a huge void, and in some ways quite a daunting void for the organisation. He's been a voice for the people, a voice for the movement, and a constant source of clarity and courage. Our loss is, of course, the gain for Friends of the Earth, even if it's hard for us to take. But it's also a gain for the movement, because with this chapter, Assad will have even greater influence to push for the justice we all fight for. But for now, I'll just hand over to Assad to say his farewell. So, Asad Rahman.
Let me also say thank you to the amazing panel and the panel earlier sisters, brothers, friends, comrades. It's always really hard to put into what it means to stand here now after 8 incredible years at War on Want. And in truth, it's War on Want, and these last 8 years has been a very critical part of the decades of struggle that has shaped every part of who I am and my politics. And of course, it isn't a goodbye. It's just a handover, one chapter to the next, because this work doesn't stop. The struggle continues, and of course, the need has never been greater. And as we heard from across both of our panels, I want to start with maybe just a small reflection. We are, of course, living through a moment of deep and deliberate crisis. Gramsci very famously said, the old world is dying, the new world struggles to be born, and now is the time of monsters. And everywhere we look, we can see those monsters. And it's not just that our planet is on fire, or that inequality is off the charts, or that genocide is happening in front of our eyes. It's that these are all the symptoms of a system that is working exactly as it was designed to do. The climate crisis is not a bug in the system. It's the final stage of an economic model that has plundered people and planet for centuries. The obscene wealth of billionaires is not a side effect. It's the outcome of a colonial legacy that continues to bleed the global south and exploit working people all over. The bombs falling on Gaza is not a side effect. It's the outcome of a colonial legacy that continues a logical extension of a global order that is built on violence, racism, and profit. As President Petro of Colombia said, in the faces of the Palestinian people, we, the people of the global south, black, brown, indigenous, we see our past, our present, and our futures. And who can doubt the reality that we are seeing a world where some lives matter more than other lives? And of course, the reality of the world that we live in, and actually the only way we survive this moment, and the only way we can win in this moment, is building power. Movement power, collective power, and global power. And that, if you listen to the climate scientists, and James mentioned that earlier, if you listen to the climate scientists, they are very, very clear. Change is now inevitable. The only question is, what kind of change are we fighting for? And the clock is ticking. We don't have hundreds of years. We don't even have decades and decades. We don't have till the end of the century. We have merely years in which to move the dial. So we're long past the point of tinkering around the edges or thinking we can fix this system with a slightly better tax rate or maybe a greener app. We can't charity our way out of poverty, and we can't recycle our way out of climate collapse. We need to change everything, and we have to have a vision that is bold enough, that is big enough and radical enough to meet the scale of this crisis. And that's why I've spent, and my colleagues here in War on Want, we spent years fighting for a global Green New Deal, not as a policy menu, but as a political project, a project rooted in justice, in repair, in redistribution, in the global south, not being an afterthought, but at the center of our solutions. Because let's be honest, the climate crisis has never just been about emissions. It's about who has power,
who is exploited and who is disposable. And it's about whose lives are collateral damage in the name of endless growth, extraction, and empire. So when we talk about a global Green New Deal, we don't mean electric cars for the rich or transitions in the north on the back of workers in the global south. We mean decolonizing the economy. We mean decarbonizing the economy. And we mean delinking the economy. That means we have to cancel illegitimate debts. We have to end the arms trade. We have to build energy systems owned by people, not for profit. We have to make food a right, not a luxury. We have to have universal public services, both here and globally. And we have to tax the rich. And we have to ask a bigger question. Why do we even have billionaires? And we have to, of course, fund a just transition for every worker everywhere. This is, of course, about reparations, not just for slavery and colonialism in the past, but for the structural violence that continues every single day through our trade rules, through our debt traps, and through our militarized borders. And to deliver that, we need to build power. And we know that power is built. Power is never granted. And from the fascists and white supremacists in the capitals of Europe, in the United States, in India, and in Argentina, to those in Tel Aviv, they are connected. They are internationalists, and they have the same playbook of bigotry, hatred, and extremism, of walls and fences, of demonizing migrants, of attacking the poor and marginalized. And those who hold power are never going to give up power willingly. We know this. And whether it's the fossil fuel companies, the arms manufacturers, or the billionaires and politicians who they have in their pockets, they are organized, they are coordinated, and they are ruthless. So we have to be even more so. As Malcolm X very famously said, we are not outnumbered, we are just being out-organized. And that means building movements that are global in scale, that are rooted in lived realities and united across borders, across issues, and across identities, where solidarity is not a slogan, but it's a strategy. And internationalism isn't just about being morally right, it's about building the only kind of power that can win. And we have to look at the lessons of history. We've seen glimpses of that power. And we know throughout history, it was the power of ordinary people that won us every victory. And I have a challenge to those like Keir Starmer who talk about the white working class in this community, in this country, and the black and white and the black and brown communities. Here, just miles from here, it was local people, Jewish community and Irish communities, Labour movement activists who stood up together against Mosley's black shirts at Cable Street and said, "No, Passeran, you shall not pass." And when the government of the day stood silent in the face of Franco's fascists in Spain, it was working class people, men and women from East London, who took up that fight and stood with the Spanish people to defend democracy. And it was here in East London that the trade union movement was born, that the suffragette movement marched and won us the right to vote, the right to organise, the right to decent pay and decent conditions. And after the horrors of the Second World War, when the economy was in ruin and this country was in flame, it was ordinary people and working people, not just from Britain, but black and brown people who defended Britain from the Nazis, who then came to this country and helped rebuild it from the ashes. And it was us who created the NHS, our welfare state, and our right to decent housing. And it was just down the road here that thousands stood on the steps of Bethnal Green Town Hall and listened to Paul Robeson, who spoke about racial capitalism and segregation and linked the fight against racism to the fight of all working class people. And just yards from here, as Alex was reminding me, we stood together with so many people in this room, shoulder to shoulder, thousands of us, when we smashed the British National Party and the National Front when they tried to march down Brick Lane. Our fight for the right to live free from attack was a fight for a truly anti-racist society. So when today we have politicians, including in our government and of course in the opposition, who want to play the race card, to stoke division, to silence dissent, we know who pays the price for their cowardice. As we can see in the pictures in Belfast and across this country last year, it is black and brown people who bleed, and it's the fascists in limousines who enter the corridors of power. So I wanted to say we are the movement. Because in our movement, we see those echoes of the past in the struggles of today. I saw it in the climate strikers when young people said, we don't want to just cut emissions, we want to cut injustice and call for an end to climate colonialism. We see it in the streets and the call for justice for Palestine when people from every community and every faith and no faith stand up for humanity, even whilst our leaders are complicit in genocide. And we see it even in the corridors of the UN summits, where frontline communities have forced climate justice and just transition onto the global agenda. We've seen it every time people refuse to be divided, whether it's by race, by nation, or by fear. But we need more than moments. We need a movement, and that movement must be anti-racist at its core. It must be feminist in its analysis. It must be eco-socialist in its economics. And it must unashamedly be revolutionary in its ambition. We have to rebuild the ties that bind us. We're told again and again that we are all alone, that the problems we face are personal failures, that we have to just look after our own. But today we've heard across both of these panels that we say we reject this lie, that we are bound together by our common humanity, by our shared struggles, and of course, by our interlinked liberation. When a child is born, buried under the rubble in Rafah, or when a grandmother skips meals in Birmingham, or where a farm worker dies in a flood in Pakistan, these are not separate tragedies. They're a price of the same system. So we have to rebuild solidarity, not as a sentiment, but as a structure. We must reconnect our struggles from food sovereignty to housing justice, from trade unions to climate activists, from debt campaigners to those campaigning against the arms trade. We must recreate the political home that we have been missing, one that holds the radical imagination and the disciplined organizing that we need. And War on Want, and I'm proud to say War on Want, has been an organization that I've had, of course, the honor of leading, but it has been and continues to be a critical part of that ecosystem, grounded in movements, accountable to communities, willing to speak uncomfortable truths to power, that has woven together these issues, that has put rebuilding internationalism and reframing anti-imperialism for this moment at its heart. So I want to end by saying there's a lot I could say about this moment, about the victories we've, of course, won and the losses that still weigh heavy. But I want to go back to the beginning of War on Want. And I think back to that moment where labor movement activists founded War on Want as an organization that would speak truth to power, that would focus on the root causes of poverty, inequality, and injustice, that would declare, even as the UK took part in a war in Korea at the time, that the only war worth fighting is the war against want. And in its first report, it was a plan for world development, which called for redirecting of military spending, for an end to colonialism, for a fight for universal public services and social justice. It was a dream of a far better, more just and equitable world. And that dream still lives on. It lives on in all workers who are organizing. It lives on in students and elders, in fighters and in dreamers. And it lives on in the people who know in their bones that this world is not for them, that we need another world that is not only possible, but is necessary. So let's rebuild our power. Let's fight for a global Green New Deal that is rooted in justice. And let's answer that question that was posed to us by the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests in France, when they said the elites worry about the end of the world, we ordinary people, we worry about the end of the month. We know that only a compact on climate and poverty will deal with this moment. And we have to remember that this argument wasn't something that was founded in the global north. It was echoed by legendary Brazilian trade unionist Chico Mendes, who said ecology without class consciousness is merely gardening. So we need to meet the material needs of our people. We need to fight against austerity for the rich, austerity for the poor, and social welfare for the rich. We have to meet the needs of people and say we can and will fight for a better world. So this moment is not for a moment when we have to stand in silence. We have to break silence. We have to stand with the oppressed, and we can win, not just for survival, for a better world, for dignity, for joy, and for life. And we have stood as War on Want with movements and all of you. And I urge, if you haven't been and you aren't a member of War on Want, please do join War on Want. And I'll see all of you on the streets as together we build that movement of movements in solidarity. Thank you.